Hello, Atheist Nerd here. Is evolution a fact? And what is the evidence for evolution? These are the topics I'll be covering in today's video. I'll be borrowing from several other video sources. With that said, let's take a look.
What was the Miller-Urey experiment? It was once believed that if you left food out to rot, living creatures like maggots and even rats would simply poof into existence. The idea was called spontaneous generation. A series of experiments starting in the 1600s disproved this idea, and in the 1800s, a new scientific law was proposed. Life only comes from life. It's true that rats, maggots, and even microbes are far too complex to simply poof into existence, but in 1859, English naturalist Charles Darwin put forth the theory of evolution. In it, he showed that under the right circumstances, relatively simple creatures can gradually give rise to more complex creatures. Given this information, serious thinkers began to wonder, is it possible that simple life forms actually could come from non-living matter? Not by poofing into existence, but through a natural gradual process similar to what we see in biological evolution. Darwin himself mentioned this idea when writing to a friend. But if, and oh what a big if, he wrote, we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, and so on present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. In 1924, Russian biochemist Alexander Oparin published a book which he titled The Origin of Life. In it, he outlined his thoughts on a gradual progression from simple chemistry to living cells. He imagined the early ocean as a primordial soup, a rich collection of complex molecules produced by natural chemical reactions. In this soup, further reactions could take place, eventually producing living cells. At the time, Darwin's warm little pond and Oparin's primordial soup were really just speculation. They were founded on a good understanding of chemistry and biology, but they could not be considered legitimate scientific hypotheses because no one had found a way to test or observe them. Science, after all, is the study of observable facts and an ongoing conversation about how those facts can be best linked together. Chemical reactions like those proposed by Darwin and Oparin are not expected to leave an observable fossil record. Without either having fossils to examine or a time machine to travel back and observe what happened, how could scientists even begin to study the origin of life? In the 1950s, Stanley Miller, then a graduate student at the University of Chicago, came up with an idea. We could simulate early Earth conditions in the lab and then carefully watch what happens. If you can't study fish in the sea, set up an aquarium. Working with his professor, Harold Urey, Miller designed an apparatus to simulate the ancient water cycle. Together they put in water to model the ancient ocean. It was gently boiled to mimic evaporation. Along with water vapor, for gases of the atmosphere they chose methane, hydrogen, and ammonia. These are simple gases which scientists at the time thought were probably abundant on the ancient Earth. They added a condenser to cool the atmosphere, allowing water molecules to form drops and fall back into their ocean like rain. The ancient Earth would have had many sources of energy, sunlight, geothermal heat, and even thunderstorms, so they added sparks to the atmosphere to simulate lightning. The goal of the experiment was not to create life, but to simply test the first step in Oparin's model. Can simple chemistry naturally give rise to the complex molecules of life? After running the experiment for just 1 week, their ocean became brownish black. Careful analysis revealed that through a series of reactions, many complex molecules had been produced. Among these were amino acids, special molecules of life that we once thought could only be built inside the bodies of living creatures. This was a pivotal breakthrough in science, so significant in fact, that it gave rise to an entirely new field of research now known as prebiotic chemistry. Scientists don't know for sure if the gases used by Miller really were the most common gases of the ancient Earth. Because of this, many experiments have since been done, showing that the molecules of life can form in a wide variety of environments with different starting chemicals and different sources of energy. Sugars, lipids, and amino acids have even been found on meteorites. This suggests that the molecules of life formed all throughout the ancient solar system and may be forming right now in other regions of our galaxy. Together, these discoveries tell us that Oparin's primordial soup and Darwin's warm little pond could have easily existed in one way or another on our ancient planet. So to sum things up, what was the Miller-Urey experiment? The Miller-Urey experiment was our first attempt at simulating ancient Earth conditions, in this case, the ancient Earth's water cycle, for the purpose of testing ideas about the origin of life. The Miller-Urey experiment is significant for two main reasons. First, though it was not a perfect simulation of the early Earth, it clearly demonstrated for the first time that biomolecules can form under ancient Earth-like conditions. Second, the experiment took what was once mere speculation, the idea that life may have emerged from chemistry, and transformed a portion of that speculation into legitimate, testable science. Many questions remain to be answered about the origin of life, but scientists from many nations and many fields of study are now following Stanley Miller's lead. They're finding ways to turn those questions about the origin of life into testable, scientific hypotheses.
We do not know everything there is to know about how life started, and we most likely never will. But we know that it is possible through this experiment that life could have began on Earth through these simple processes. Science involves having to recreate what a situation may have been like. In physics, that may look like a particle collider. In biology, it looks like this. And over time, very simple organisms could have developed, and we have fossil records of some of these. Simple organisms that could develop over time, and then could change and spread across the world into new and different kinds of organisms. But how do you get from the simple organisms to the more complex? Let's ask Bill Nye.
Bill Nye here, explaining evolution with emoji. Take a look at this one. It's a molecule. Now, molecules just happen. Look at any asteroid. It's loaded with amino acids, a carbon and oxygen, oxygen. Well, somehow, probably with energy from the sun, these molecules hooked together and accidentally found ways to reproduce themselves, the same way crystals reproduce if you leave them alone for a while. Anyway, these self-replicating molecules could not make perfect copies of themselves, and the imperfections that helped them make more copies stayed there, kept getting reproduced and reproduced and reproduced. And pretty soon you had complicated things like bacteria. And then you got multiple bacteria becoming multicellular organisms like poison ivy plants and barnacles and sea jellies and even my old boss. And the key to this is time. People used to think the Earth was a few thousand years old. Then they realized it was at least a few hundreds of millions of years old. Well, now, using radioactivity, we can tell you that the Earth is 4.54 billion years old. A lot can happen in 4.5 billion years. Get a mirror, take a look at yourself. We are all a result of evolution.
So basically what we have is we have changes that occur over time because as you replicate a model, the model is changing over time. You don't have the exact same model. There's a slight difference sometimes. And that slight difference is also going to replicate. And you have tons of ones that are similar to A, and then A has a slight difference, that's B, and tons that are similar to B, and then it goes on to C and D, and they're all slightly different, but as you get further and further along this line, you get to ZZZ, and you have something way different. You have a bacteria cell, and then you have some kind of other more complex cell, and over time this is going to change how life looks on our Earth. In the case for Darwin, he noticed that the finches on the Galapagos Island, for instance, had different beak sizes. Now, what guided the change, however, wasn't just that it happened to be that there was a difference in A and B, but that the food types on the islands had different types of beaks that would be best for actually getting to that food source. In other words, the birds with the best beaks for that particular fruit on that particular island were the birds you found on there. The birds with the stronger beak for being able to crush the fruit, you'd find those on the fruit island. Some birds for spearing insects were over on the island where it was bountiful with insects. And the difference was that if you had a bird and it was on the wrong island or unable to actually get to its food source, it would die out. That's obvious. So he proposed that nature selects for certain types of attributes of different organisms. And if you were more fit, or in other words, you had the characteristics that went best for your environment, then you survived better than those with characteristics that weren't as fit or weren't as qualifying for that particular environment. During the Industrial Revolution, we have light moths and dark moths. Light moths blended in on the light trees better. And at first all of the trees were light. Birds would come along and they would eat the dark moths but leave the light moths alive. The Industrial Revolution, however, caused a bunch of soot to go in the air and darken the trees. The result was that the dark moths now survived better and the light ones were eaten by the birds. This is a demonstration of natural selection occurring, and over time, the light moths, as they die out, would not be able to pass on as many genes as the dark moths, and the trait for darkness would remain in the environment. But the light moth genes would be less likely to remain. So although there may be a lot of different configurations for what kind of species could survive, overall, the environment guides the process and makes it where only certain types of species can survive, and it depends a lot on what's going on, and also the time factor. How long does it take for everything to happen? Now, what other evidence is there for evolution? Let's see if Stated Clearly can answer this for us.
The theory of biological evolution makes two very bold claims about living creatures. First, all living things on Earth are related. They evolved from a common ancestor. Second, the evolution of living things is powered by natural processes, things which can be studied and understood. But is there really any evidence that these two claims are true? Yes. There are so many observable facts from so many different fields of study that the only way we can even begin to talk about them is to group them into categories or lines of evidence. To keep things simple, here we'll focus on evolution's first claim that all living things on Earth are related. We cannot tackle the entire tree of life at once. After all, there's an estimated 8.7 million species alive today. So instead, we'll focus most of our attention on one fairly small but fascinating branch of the evolutionary tree, cetaceans. This branch includes whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Biologists tell us that all these creatures are closely related, and that the entire group evolved from an ancient four-legged land mammal. Instead of taking their word for it, let's look at the facts. We'll start by looking at a few from the field of comparative anatomy, the study of differences and similarities between living things. Whales live in water, and from a distance, they sort of look like giant fish. A close inspection of their anatomy, however, tells us a very different story. Whales, just like land mammals but unlike fish, have placentas and give live birth. They feed milk to their young. They are warm-blooded, which is extremely rare for a fish. And whales do not have gills. Instead, just like us, they breathe air with two fully developed lungs. Whales don't seem to have noses like mammals do. Instead, they breathe through blowholes coming out the tops of their heads. Some whales have two blowholes which almost look like nostrils, but dolphins and porpoises only have one. Surprisingly, if you look at their skulls, you find that the blowhole splits into two nasal passages inside the head. Could it be that the blowhole is actually a highly modified mammal nose? It looks that way, but we'll need more evidence to be sure. Many whales have hair, just like land mammals. In this photograph, you can actually see the whiskers of this baby gray whale as he rests his chin on mama's back. Strangely, whales have arm, wrist, hand, and finger bones inside their front flippers. Here's a photo of these bones, the same bones that bats, hippos, and people have in their front appendages. 1 bone, 2 bones, wrist, hand, and finger bones. Modern whales do not have back legs, but they do have a strange pair of bones where the hind legs should be. Here's a picture of these bones from a bowhead whale. They almost look like shriveled hip, thigh, and shin bones. This one even has a ball and socket joint between the hip and thigh bone, just like the ball and socket joint in your own hip. Is this resemblance a mere coincidence, or are these real leg bones? Perhaps leftovers from the whale's evolutionary history? Before we draw any bold conclusions, let's see if a completely separate line of evidence will confirm our suspicions. Embryology is the study of how creatures develop before being born or hatching from an egg. Here we see a dolphin and a human embryo side by side at similar stages of development. Notice that they both have what look like arm buds and leg buds. In humans, the leg buds grow to become legs. In whales, they grow for a while but then stop, effectively fading away as the rest of the whale continues to grow. These are all photographs of a common dolphin at different stages of growth. Notice that early on, we see 2 nostril grooves on the front of the face, just like you'd expect in a puppy or a human. As the dolphin continues to grow, the nostrils migrate to the top of the head and fuse together, becoming the dolphin's blowhole. So far, we have multiple facts from 2 independent lines of study, comparative anatomy and embryology, that are both telling us the same story. The ancestors of whales were once 4-legged land creatures. Will the fossil record act as a third witness, confirming this idea? These are 2 species of extinct basilosaurid whales. These animals are known from multiple well-preserved skeletons, and they appear to have lived side by side, roughly 34 to 40 million years ago. In this photograph, we're looking down at the top of a basilosaurid skull. This is not a model or a cast, these are the actual bones which were pulled from the ground. Notice that the nasal opening is not on the top of the head like those of modern whales, and not at the end of the snout like those of land mammals. Instead, it's right in the middle. This is an intermediate species, exactly what evolution tells us we should find. At the back end of a basilosaurid's body, there are small, yet fully developed hips, legs, ankle, feet, and toe bones. These legs are far too small for walking on land, but they may have been useful while mating, or for scratching away parasites and itchy skin. Evolutionary theory tells us that the further we go back in time, the harder it should be to distinguish whales from normal land mammals. Meet Maiacetus. The hip bones of Maiacetus seem sturdy enough to walk on land, but this animal is considered to be a whale for many reasons. Their skeletons have all been found among fossils of sea creatures, which tells us they lived in the ocean. Their short legs, combined with long, flat fingers and toes, suggest they were strong swimmers with webbed hands and feet. Here we see the bottom side of a Maiacetus jaw and skull. Her teeth match those of the basilosaurid whales we saw earlier, and the unique structures of her middle ear bones match those of basilosaurid whales and modern whales. Maiacetus appears to be a walking whale. Scientists have found the fossils of many ancient whale-like mammals and continue to find more. Together, these fossils blur the line between 4-legged land mammals and fully aquatic modern whales, solidifying the idea that whales indeed evolved from land creatures. Now let's look at a 4th line of evidence, DNA. DNA molecules contain chemical codes which act like recipes for living things. Without ever looking at bones, embryos, or anatomy, researchers can compare the DNA code of different living creatures to find out who is most closely related to who. Whale DNA has been compared to all kinds of other animals, fish, sea lions, you name it, and so far, the closest genetic match is to the pudgy, water-loving hippopotamus. This does not mean that whales evolved from hippos, but if this genetic finding is correct, whales and hippos both evolved from a common ancestor that lived roughly 54 million years ago. At first, the link between whales and hippos surprised researchers because whales are mainly carnivores. They eat things like fish and small crustaceans. Hippos, on the other hand, are mostly vegetarian. A closer look, however, reveals that hippos and whales actually share many strange features, some of which may have come from their common ancestor. Ancient walking whales have specially shaped ankle bones found only in hippos and the close relatives of hippos. Just like whales, hippos are known to give birth and even nurse their young underwater. They both have multi-chambered stomachs, which is common for herbivores, but is almost unheard of for meat-eating mammals. They are both missing a coat of fur. And here's a fun fact. Whales and hippos are among the only mammals on Earth that have internal testicles. So there you have it. 4 independent lines of evidence all tell us the exact same story. Whales evolved from 4-legged land mammals. But the history of whales is not the only evolutionary history that we've been able to work out. We know from fossils, DNA, embryology, and many other lines of evidence that bird wings are actually modified arms and claws. Birds evolved from dinosaur-like ancestors. We can also clearly see that bat wings evolved from 5-fingered hands, very similar to those of monkeys and shrews. We've found that humans share a fairly recent common ancestor with chimpanzees, that mammals evolved from reptile-like creatures, those reptile-like creatures evolved from amphibian-like creatures, those amphibian-like creatures evolved from fish-like creatures, and fish, if you go back far enough, share a common ancestor with segmented worms. So to sum things up, thousands of observable facts from completely independent fields of study have come together to tell us the exact same story.
And they just talked about the line for whales. There are a lot of other evidences for evolution. And that evidence is pretty convincing and pretty strong. It relies on convincing logic that can be easily followed and does not have to make any kind of leaps. The evidence is so strong we can easily diagram what it looked like for the whales to evolve, where they came from, and we can make this link to the fossil record, and we can also link it to the various DNA codes that we have about current day animals, and possibly if we get DNA from some of the ancient fossils. It also should help us to ask questions like, when we see a fish and it has little leg-like appendages, what does that mean? Does that imply that the fish is trying to crawl up on land? Now, an appendage may imply something, but it alone does not mean that something is the case. However, using other types of evidence, we can see that the line of reasoning follows certain direction. That with the fossil record, all of this stuff makes sense to have evolved the way it has. That over time the traits are changing, and because the traits are changing, we are getting new different types of species that are slowly coming about and crawling up on the land. But is this the same for humans? Have humans evolved? Do we have any proof of this? Let's see what SciShow has to say about this topic.
So 65 million years ago, catastrophe wiped out the dinosaurs, and we saw the adaptive radiation of a tiny shrew-like ancestor of humans that would look more at home like next to a hamster wheel than in your family album. Let's set the stage in the thought bubble. So the slow waltz of plate tectonics continued to pull Eurasia and the Americas apart, expanding the Atlantic Ocean. Primates colonized the Americas, and separated by the vast Atlantic, continued their separate evolution into the New World monkeys, which is not a band name, although it should be. Then, around 45 million years ago, Australia split from Antarctica, and while mammals outcompeted most marsupials in the Americas, except animals like possums, Australia saw an adaptive radiation of marsupials. This, of course, meant that later, about 100,000 years ago, when the Americas were having their share of mammoths and saber-toothed tigers, Australia was having a spell of gigantic kangaroos, marsupial lions, and wombats the size of hippos. Then, somewhere around 40 million years ago, India, which had been floating around the southern oceans as an island, smashed into the Eurasian continent with such force that it created the world's tallest mountain range, the Himalayas. Meanwhile, in Africa, primates continued to evolve, and 25 to 30 million years ago, the line of the apes diverged from the old world monkeys. And no, neither you nor a chimp is a monkey, nor did we evolve from the monkeys that are around today. Those are like our cousins. Moreover, we did not evolve from chimpanzees. The chimpanzee is a cousin as well, not an uncle. We are not more highly evolved than they are. are. Instead, our lines of descent split off from a common ancestor with chimpanzees about 7 million years ago. Then chimpanzees further split into a separate species, the bonobos. Knowing about this common ancestry tells us a lot about our shared traits with other primates. For instance, we all have fairly large brains relative to our body mass. We have our eyes in the front of our heads from the days when we hung out in trees, and depth perception was an excellent way of telling how far away the next tree branch was so as to prevent us from plummeting to our deaths. And we also have grasping hands to make sure, that you could hold on to the branch in question. Primates also have hierarchies, social orders, whether male or female led, that determine who gets primary access to food, mates, and other benefits.
Thanks, Thought Bubble. So our closest evolutionary cousins, the chimpanzees, can tell us a thing or two about shared behaviors. For one thing, while all primates have a hierarchy of alphas and betas, humans and chimps, who share 98.4% of their DNA, are the most prone to team up together and launch a revolution against the alpha male. We're also both prone to ganging up, roaming our territory, and beating up unsuspecting foreigners of the same species, and not for direct survival reasons. Chimpanzees have been observed finding a lone chimp male from another group and kicking, hitting, and tearing off bits of his body and then leaving the helpless victim to die of his wounds. And humans definitely bear this stamp of our lowly origin, where indeed the imperfect step-by-step process of evolution made us highly intelligent, but still with prefrontal cortexes too small and adrenal glands maybe too big. Aggression and bloodlust are definitely part of our shared heritage, and looking at more recent human history, does that really surprise anyone? Contrast that behavior for a moment with the more peaceful bonobos, who are female-led, and when a male in a group gets a bit pushy, the females are prone to gang up and teach him a lesson. When it comes to intergroup encounters in the wild, the male bonobos seem tense around strangers at first, until, usually, the females from each group cross over and just have sex with the newcomers, completely diffusing the tension. Talk about make love, not war. Bonobos are hippies. While our common ancestor with chimpanzees around 7 million years ago was more suited to living in forests and seeking refuge from danger by climbing trees, climate change in East Africa made things colder and drier, and many forests were replaced by woodlands and wide open savanna. Life in the savanna meant our ancestors needed to run from predators rather than climbing trees, so our line shifted away from the bow-legged stance reminiscent of chimpanzees and developed bipedalism, where our locomotion came from legs that were straight and forward-facing. There's still some debate about when bipedalism first began, but we know that by the first Australopithecines around 4 million years ago, our evolutionary line was bipedal. This also freed up our hands. Australopithecines were not very tall, standing only just above a meter, or just over 3.5 feet, and had brains only a little bigger than modern chimpanzees. They were largely herbivores with teeth adapted for grinding tough fruits and leaves. Australopithecines may have communicated through gestures and primitive sounds, but their higher larynx meant that they couldn't make the range of sounds required for complex language. There was probably a lot of pointing and grunting going on, kind of like me before 6 a.m. By 2.3 million years ago, Homo habilis arrived on the scene. They weren't much taller than Australopithecines, but they had significantly larger brains, though still a lot smaller than later species. Excitingly, Homo habilis is known to have hit flakes off of stones to use them for cutting. Now, lots of species use tools. For instance, chimpanzees use sticks for fishing termites out of the ground, and they use rock hammers and leaf sponges and branch levers and banana leaf umbrellas. A lot of these skills don't seem to arise spontaneously just because of the intelligence of individuals, but like in the case of termite fishing, chimpanzees pass the information on by imitation. Primate see, primate do. In a way, this social learning is sort of cultural, yet succeeding generations of chimpanzees don't accumulate information, tinker with it, and improve upon it, so that after 100 years, chimpanzees are owners of highly efficient and wealthy termite fishing corporations. Similarly, as impressive as Homo habilis' stoneworking abilities are, we see very little sign of technological improvement over the thousands and thousands of years that habilis existed. Same goes for Homo ergaster erectus, who was around 1.9 million years ago. Homo ergaster erectus had an even bigger brain, was taller, and they even seemed intelligent and adaptable enough to move into different environments across the old world. They may have even begun our first clumsy attempts at fire, which is vital for cooking meat and vegetables, opening up opportunities for more energy and even more brain growth. But still, there's not much sign of technological improvement. Their tools got the job done. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Yet 1.78 million years ago, we do see Homo ergaster creating a wide new range of teardrop hand axes in Kenya. By 1.5 million years ago, these teardrop axes had rapidly become common and had improved in quality and were shaped with a flat edge into multi-purpose picks, cleavers, and so forth. Archaeologists see this as the first possible sign of tinkering and improvement of technology that may have been transmitted by social learning. A faint glimmer of something new. Why is this important? Well, humans didn't get to where we are because we're super geniuses. It's not like the Xbox One was just invented out of the blue one day. It was an improvement upon the Xbox 360, which was an improvement upon earlier consoles, arcade machines, and computers, and backward onto the dawn of video games. In the same way, we didn't just invent our modern society by sudden inspiration. It's the result of 250,000 years of tinkering and improvement. This is where accumulation accumulation matters. It's called collective learning, the ability of a species to retain more information with one generation than is lost by the next. This is what has taken us in a few thousand years from stone tools to rocket engines to being able to have the Crash Course theme song as your ringtone. Progress. If there was collective learning in Homo ergaster, it was very slow and very slight. This may have been due to limitations on communication, abstract thought, group size, or just plain brain power. But over the next 2 million years, things started to pick up. Homo antecessor, Homo heidelbergensis, and the Neanderthals developed the first systematically controlled use of fire in hearths, the first blade tools, the earliest wooden spears, the earliest use of composite tools, where stone was fastened to wood, all before Homo sapiens were ever heard of around 250,000 years ago. Neanderthals even moved into colder climates where they were compelled to invent clothing. They used complex tool manufacture to produce sharp points in scrapers and hand axes and wood handles, and they improved their craft over time. While evolution by natural selection is a sort of learning mechanism that allows a species to adapt generation after generation with a lot of trial and error and death, collective learning allows for tinkering, adaptation, and improvement on a much faster scale with each generation and across generations without waiting for your genes to catch up. Anatomically similar Homo sapiens have been around for about 250,000 years, and throughout that time we've been expanding our toolkit from stone tools to shellfishing to trade and actual fishing, mining, and by 40,000 years ago we had art, including cave images, decorative beads, and other forms of jewelry, and even the world's oldest known musical instruments, flutes carved from mammoth ivory and bird bones. All this stuff came about as a result of collective learning. As long as you have a population of potential innovators who can keep dreaming up new ideas and remembering old ones, and an opportunity for those innovators to pass their ideas on to others, you're likely to have some technological progress. These mechanisms are still working today. We've got over 7 billion potential innovators on this planet and almost instantaneous communication, allowing us to do so many marvelous things, including teach you about big history on the internet.
So life for early humans was pretty good. Like, foraging didn't require particularly long hours. The average workday for a forager was about 6.5 hours. When you compare that to an average of 9.5 hours for a peasant farmer in medieval Europe, or the average of 9 hours for a typical office worker today, foraging seems downright leisurely. Quick aside, I work 30 minutes a day less than a peasant farmer in medieval Europe. That's not progress. Stan, I want more time off. Stan just pointed out that I have a chair, something that peasant farmers in medieval Europe did not enjoy, and I want to say that I'm very grateful for my chair. Thank you for my chair, Stan. Anyway, a forager would go out, hunt or gather, come home, eat, spend time with the family, dance, sing, tell stories. And foragers were also always on the move, which made it less likely that they'd contaminate their water or sit around waiting for a plague to develop. And with their constant walking and their varied diet, foragers were in many ways healthier than the peasants of ancient civilizations. They were also in some ways healthier than us, but we have antibiotics for now, so we live longer. For now. The classical view of foraging life is best expressed by Thomas Hobbes, who wrote, "No arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." Except not really. I mean, life for the average person in 12th century France was also a smidge nasty, brutish, and short. And the lack of wealth disparity in foraging cultures may imply greater equality between social rankings and even between the genders, since female gatherers appear to be responsible for the majority of food collected rather than the hunting males. And from that perspective, life was kind of ruined by the advent of agriculture and then later with states. As Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, the first person who, having enclosed a plot of land, took it into his head to say, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. What crimes, wars, murders, what miseries and horrors would the human race have been spared had someone pulled up the stakes or filled in the ditch and cried out to his fellow man, "Do not listen to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to all and the earth to no one." And thus summarizes one of the great debates in the world of political science. Man, big history discusses everything. Now, it's possible that neither Rousseau nor Hobbes was completely correct, and that, like, private property and agriculture didn't create the glory days or end them. Like, as previously mentioned, all primates have a dominance hierarchy of some kind. Also, you don't need a wealth disparity to drive human beings to hurt each other. Like, surveys of excavated remains from the Paleolithic indicate a murder rate that was possibly as high as 10%. Now, those statistics are still disputed, but despite the relatively short workday, life in the Paleolithic sounds a lot less appealing when you consider the high murder rate and also the occasional infanticide. That's not even to mention the old or disabled people who, when they couldn't keep up anymore, were abandoned to die in the wild. I can't help but feel that I might not have thrived in the Paleolithic, what with my visual impairment, and general lack of interest in hunting. Anyway, we call this the Hobbes versus Rousseau debate, and it's still unresolved. I mean, humans may have been corrupted in many ways by society. On the other hand, it's possible a lot of the crimes and follies of human history may just be symptoms of our coping with the bad wiring left to us by evolution. You know, humans are a bit of an obsolete machine. We aren't particularly well suited to the many lifestyle changes that have happened in the past few thousand years, faster than our genes can keep pace with. But how you interpret the lives of early human foragers largely determines your view of history and also the fundamental nature of the human character. Ask yourself which side you sit on. Is humanity fundamentally good and corrupted by technology and modern social orders? Or are we fundamentally flawed and in need of some sort of structure and authority? Or is there some kind of both-and way of addressing the question? Here at Crash Course, we don't have answers, but we are grateful that you're pondering these questions with us. In any case, collective learning was really good for our survival, but then, 74,000 years ago, disaster struck. A super eruption at Mount Toba on the island of Sumatra in present-day Indonesia clouded the skies with ash and cooled the climate. Plants and animals, aka food, died off, and genetic studies showed that this reduced the human population to a few thousand people. So as a result of this, we aren't exactly inbred, but there's more genetic diversity between two of the major groups of chimpanzees in Africa than there is in all of humanity. So this small group heroically recovered and spread out of Africa 64,000 years ago, colonizing diverse environments and continuing to innovate. For 13.8 billion years since the beginning of the universe, complexity had been rising in a powerful crescendo.
We have a long primate history. And over time, things like tools and culture and other kinds of evolutionary strategies have come about so that we have changed from where we started. And we have the fossil records and our own history to show how these things have come about. Evolution is full of facts. Thanks for watching. I sure hope you learned something new. Also, in the description, I will post all these videos, as well as a web page where you can look up all the different resources that have been found and all the facts about evolution. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.